Winter arrived in Frost Creek the way old grief does, quietly at first, then all at once, until the world seemed to exist only in shades of white and waiting. Snow pressed against rooftops like a held breath. The creek froze mid-sentence. Wind slid through the valley carrying the smell of iron, pine, and memory, and every sound felt distant, as though the land itself had grown tired of listening. People said the winter that year would not let go, and those who had lived long enough knew that some seasons were not measured by weather, but by what they refused to release. Eloan Hartwell woke before dawn, as she always did, her joints already aware of the cold before her eyes opened. At 58, her white hair had surrendered to the truth without argument, braided neatly down her back, silver against the brown wool of her nightdress. She lay still for a moment, listening to the boarding-house settle, counting the seconds between gusts of wind as if they were heartbeats. The room smelled of soap, old books and wood smoke soaked deep into the walls. It was the smell of a life pared down to essentials. Outside, Frost Creek waited. The town had been built by hands that believed permanence was something you could hammer into place, but winter reminded everyone otherwise. Doors creaked. Shutters rattled. The road vanished beneath drifts that erased direction. Eloan rose, lit the stove, and set water to boil, performing the small rituals that gave shape to days that might otherwise dissolve into silence. Cooking, cleaning, tending, these were acts of survival disguised as routine. The boarding house took in whoever the weather stranded. Trappers with frostbitten fingers, railroad men waiting for tracks that might never come, preachers who spoke too loudly about salvation. Eloan fed them all without comment. She listened more than she spoke. Listening, she had learned, gave you warning before pain arrived. That morning, the snow fell thicker, the kind that swallowed footprints within minutes. Eloan wrapped herself in a shawl and stepped outside to fetch firewood, only to stop short at the sight of a stranger already there. He stood near the woodpile, bare-chested despite the cold, his skin dark against the white world, muscles moving with deliberate economy as he split logs. Steam rose from him, not bravado but heat earned through work. He was tall, unnaturally so it seemed to her, and carried himself with a stillness that suggested patience rather than threat. Taza Red Elk did not look at her right away. When he did, it was brief, respectful, as though he were acknowledging a boundary. His hair was tied back, his expression unreadable, eyes reflecting the gray of the sky. An Apache scout, someone whispered later, hired by the sheriff to track winter thieves and lost men. Eloan nodded once, uncertain why her chest felt tight, then retreated indoors without a word. By noon, the woodpile was stacked higher than she remembered it ever being. No knock came at the door. No request for payment. Only the evidence of effort left behind like a signature written in labor. Eloan stood at the window, watching snow bury his tracks, and felt something shift. Small, unwelcome, and alive. Gratitude, perhaps. Or the beginning of trouble. The town noticed him immediately. Frost Creek always noticed what did not belong. At the general store, whispers followed his shadow. At church, heads bent closer together. Sheriff Amos Calder spoke of necessity and order, of winter requiring hard choices, but his eyes lingered too long on the Apache's bare hands, as if measuring them for danger. Miriam Fitch crossed herself whenever Taza passed, her mouth pinched with disapproval that had little to do with scripture. Eloan heard all of it while stirring stew, while folding sheets, while pretending not to listen. The words settled anyway, heavy as snow on a roof. She had lived long enough to recognize the shape of judgment before it took form. It pressed inward, narrowing the space she was allowed to occupy. A woman her age had no business noticing a man like that, let alone feeling the echo of his presence long after he was gone. Yet the days continued, each marked by quiet exchanges. A repaired shutter she had not asked for. A rabbit left skinned and clean on the back step. Eloan responded in kind, setting aside bread, a bowl of stew, never waiting to see him take it. Their connection existed in the margins, unspoken, careful. It was safer that way. Winter deepened. Storms came in waves, reshaping the land until Frost Creek felt unmoored from the rest of the world. One evening, as Eloan struggled with a frozen latch, Taza appeared beside her, steadying the door with one gloved hand. Their fingers did not touch. The nearness was enough, She smelled snow and leather, felt the quiet gravity of him, and for a moment the years between who she had been and who she was collapsed into something dangerously thin. "Thank you," she said, the word unfamiliar in her mouth. He inclined his head. "It is cold," he replied, as if that explained everything. That night, Eloan lay awake long after the fire burned low. She told herself stories she had practiced for years, that her life was settled, that wanting was a young woman's foolishness, that winter was no time to invite change. Outside, the wind howled its disagreement, rattling the windows like a challenge. Somewhere beyond the dark, Taza Red Elk moved through the snow with purpose, unafraid of what the cold demanded. The next morning brought no relief, only a pale sun trapped behind cloud, casting no warmth, only light enough to reveal what had already been decided. At the store, Eloan felt the glances sharpen, curiosity edging toward suspicion. She heard her name paired with pauses, with raised brows, with the careful cruelty of half-spoken concern. Winter made people fearful, and fear made them tidy, eager to sort the world into what was permitted and what must be kept at a distance. Eloan carried her purchases home through the snow, spine straight, refusing the comfort of haste, knowing that dignity was sometimes the only shelter left. By evening, another storm gathered, low and restless, promising to stay. Eloan banked the fire and stood at the window once more. The yard lay empty, the woodpile high, the path erased. Somewhere beyond the drifted fences, Taza Red Elk existed within the same cold, bound to the same relentless season. The thought settled in her like a secret. She pressed her palm to the glass, feeling the chill seep through, and understood that winter had not come merely to test the town, but to ask her a question she had spent years avoiding, one she could no longer pretend not to hear. It felt like standing at the edge of a frozen river, knowing the ice might hold, or might not. At all. Yet. By the time winter settled into its deepest grip, Frost Creek had already made up its mind. Towns like this always did, quietly at first, then all at once, as if belief were a shared fire that only burned when everyone agreed to tend it. Snow smothered the streets, but it could not muffle speculation. Words traveled faster than footsteps, slipping through doorways, lingering in the corners of the general store, warming themselves beside other people's fears. Eloan Hartwell felt it before she heard it, the subtle change in how the air moved around her, the way conversations thinned when she entered a room. She noticed it in the smallest things. A pause that lasted a breath too long. A smile that did not reach the eyes. Miriam Fitch no longer greeted her with scripture, but with silence sharp enough to cut. Even old Thomas Kincaid, who had once asked after her health with genuine concern, now measured his words as if they carried weight he did not want to be seen holding. Frost Creek had decided that something was amiss, and once a town reached that conclusion, it rarely concerned itself with evidence. Eloan continued her days unchanged, or so she told herself. She rose before dawn, coaxed warmth from the stove, kneaded bread with hands that remembered 100 winters. Yet beneath the routine, something had shifted. She could feel it in her shoulders, drawn tighter, in the way she kept her gaze level when walking through town. At 58, she had learned how to survive attention by refusing to acknowledge it. Invisibility, once earned, was not easily surrendered. Taza Red Elk did not seek the town's approval. He moved through Frost Creek with the same deliberate calm he carried through the wilderness, speaking little, observing much. The sheriff found him useful and therefore tolerable, assigning him tasks that kept him moving at the edges of settlement. Tracks to follow. Supplies to escort. Men to retrieve when winter swallowed them whole. Each job completed added a reluctant notch of respect, but respect did not erase difference. It only sharpened it. People watched the Apache with the kind of curiosity that disguised itself as vigilance. They counted the days he remained. They noticed when he passed Eloan's boarding house and did not look away. They noticed the woodpile that never shrank, the broken fence mended without request, the way storms seemed less cruel where his presence lingered. Frost Creek did not know what to make of a man who gave without asking and left without explanation. Eloan heard the rumors before they reached her name directly. At first, they were framed as concern. Was she feeling well? Had the cold been too much for her? Living alone at her age was no small thing, people said, voices lowered, brows knit with practiced sympathy. Then the questions sharpened. Why was there always fresh wood outside her door? Why did the Apache linger near her property? Who had invited him into her life? One afternoon, Sheriff Amos Calder came by under the pretense of checking the road conditions. He stood in her doorway, hat in hand, snow melting from his boots onto her clean floor. His voice was measured, almost kind, but his words carried the weight of authority like a warning disguised as advice. The town was uneasy, he said. Winter made people anxious. Appearances mattered more when fear had nowhere else to go. Eloan listened, her hands folded in her apron, her face calm. She did not defend herself. She did not explain. Years ago, she might have felt compelled to justify her choices, to reassure others that she understood her place. Now, she simply nodded, thanked him for his concern, and watched him leave with an expression he could not quite name. It unsettled him more than any argument would have. The next storm arrived without ceremony, burying Frost Creek under drifts that bent fences and erased paths. When a rancher's boy failed to return home before dark, it was Taza who followed the faint trail beyond town, who carried the half-frozen child back through whiteout conditions without pausing for rest. Gratitude spread quickly, but it was careful, contained. People praised his strength, his usefulness, never his presence. Frost Creek accepted what it needed and withheld the rest. Eloan stood among the gathered townsfolk as the boy was reunited with his family, her breath visible in the cold. She caught Taza's eye across the crowd. There was no triumph in his expression, only quiet resolve. Later, as dusk settled, she found a small bundle on her back step. Fire-starting shavings, dried carefully, wrapped against moisture. A simple thing. An intimate one. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the gesture settle somewhere deep and unsteady. That night, she dreamed of voices calling her name, not unkindly, but with insistence. When she woke, the house felt larger, emptier. She sat at the table long after breakfast should have been finished, staring at the grain of the wood as if it held answers. Loving attention, she knew, was not the same as inviting trouble. The town's belief was hardening, taking shape around her whether she consented or not. The following days brought more signs of division. Miriam Fitch crossed the street rather than pass Eloan. A pair of women paused their conversation mid-sentence when she approached, their faces flushing with guilt that did nothing to soften the exclusion. Frost Creek had begun to rewrite her story, and she recognized the danger of allowing others to decide what her life meant. Taza remained steady amid the shifting currents. He said little, but his actions spoke with increasing clarity. When a roof collapsed under the weight of snow, he was there before the sun rose. When supplies ran low, he guided a sled through a pass others feared to attempt. Each act drew the town's dependence tighter, even as suspicion lingered. It was a balance as delicate as ice over moving water. One evening, as Eloan carried a lantern to the yard, she found him waiting at the fence, his silhouette dark against the snow. He did not step closer. He did not apologize for the trouble others imagined. "They are watching," he said simply, as if stating the weather. "I know," she replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of wind combing through bare branches. In that quiet, something passed unspoken, an acknowledgment of the cost that attention demanded. When he left, the lantern light lingered on the path he took, long after his footsteps vanished. Frost Creek slept uneasily that night, convinced it had named the problem and therefore controlled it. Eloan stood at her window, watching snow erase the world beyond her glass. The town believed it understood her, believed it had drawn the lines clearly. She rested her hand against the cold pane and realized, with a clarity that startled her, that belief could be heavier than truth and far more dangerous. The storm arrived without warning, not with thunder or drama, but with a quiet insistence that folded the world inward. Snow fell thicker than before, heavy flakes pressing against the land until Frost Creek seemed to shrink beneath their weight. Sound dulled. Distance disappeared. By dusk, the road out of town was gone entirely, swallowed by white, and the boarding house stood alone in a field of silence, its windows glowing like held breath. Eloan felt the storm before she saw it, a tightening in the air, a pressure that made her pause mid-task. She banked the fire higher than usual, laid out extra blankets, and moved through the house with a care born of long experience. Winter demanded preparation, but this one felt personal, as though it had chosen her doorstep to make its point. Outside, the wind rose, rattling shutters with a persistence that bordered on impatience. A knock came just as darkness settled fully, sharp against the rising howl. Eloan froze, her heart lifting and sinking at once. Visitors after nightfall were rare in such weather, and she knew without knowing who stood on the other side. When she opened the door, the storm rushed in around Taza Red Elk, snow clinging to his hair, his coat rimmed with ice. His face was drawn, eyes dark with urgency. He had tracked a lost trapper to the ridge, and barely made it back before the whiteout closed behind him. "You can stay," Eloan said before he spoke, the words leaving her mouth as naturally as breath. He nodded once, stepping inside, careful to shake the snow from his boots. The door closed, shutting out the storm, and with it the watching eyes of Frost Creek. The house seemed smaller with him there, warmer, the air charged with something neither of them named. Eloan handed him a cup of broth, their fingers brushing briefly, a contact so slight it felt imagined, yet it left a warmth that traveled up her arm. They spoke little at first. The fire crackled, throwing shadows that danced along the walls. Outside, wind battered the house, relentless, as if determined to remind them that escape was no longer an option. Eloan watched Taza warm his hands, noticing the scars along his knuckles, the careful way he held himself, always aware of space, of boundaries. She wondered how many winters he had survived by listening more than speaking. When he finally spoke, it was not about the storm. He told her of the mountains, of trails that vanished under snow, of silence so complete it felt like standing inside your own thoughts. His voice was low, steady, carrying no embellishment. Eloan listened, drawn by the rhythm, by the sense that he trusted her with words he rarely shared. In return, she spoke of the boarding house, of the years since her husband's death, of learning how to fill rooms with usefulness when love had emptied them. She did not speak of loneliness directly. She did not need to. Hours passed unnoticed. The storm showed no sign of easing. At some point, the lamp guttered low, and Eloan rose to tend it, her joints stiff from the cold. Taza moved to help without asking, steadying the ladder with a hand braced against the wall. The closeness was unavoidable now, the space between them charged with unspoken understanding. Eloan felt the weight of her age in that moment, the lines etched by years of restraint, and wondered what he saw when he looked at her. A gust of wind shook the house hard enough to rattle dishes. Eloan startled, and before she could stop herself, reached for him. His hand closed around hers instinctively, warm and sure. Neither moved to pull away. The contact was not hurried or hungry, but it held a gravity that made the room feel smaller still. Eloan's breath caught, and with it a realization she had been carefully avoiding. "I should not," she began, the words thin and inadequate. Taza did not interrupt. He did not reassure. He waited, his grip gentle, as though giving her the space to choose what came next. She withdrew her hands slowly, the loss of warmth immediate and sharp. She turned back to the fire, busying herself with the kettle, needing the distance to gather what remained of her resolve. They slept in separate rooms, the house arranged to allow propriety, even when the world outside dissolved. Eloan lay awake, listening to the storm, to the subtle sounds of another presence under her roof. Her thoughts moved in restless circles, touching truths she had long kept buried. She had told herself that desire was a young woman's folly, that safety lay in predictability. Yet here she was, heart awake in a way it had not been for decades, questioning the rules she had lived by. Morning brought no dawn, only a pale light filtered through endless snow. The storm had claimed the day as well as the night. Over breakfast, they spoke again, this time of what waited beyond winter. Taza spoke of moving on when the passes cleared, of work that followed the seasons. Eloan nodded, understanding the necessity of impermanence even as it tightened something in her chest. She spoke of the boarding house, of its quiet purpose, of how it anchored her to the town even when she felt its distance. As the day wore on, the storm began to weaken, its fury spent. By afternoon, the wind softened, and the snow fell less insistently. Taza rose, gathering his things, the decision already made. Eloin walked him to the door, her movements deliberate, her face composed. Outside, the world lay changed, smoothed over, waiting to be marked again. At the threshold, he paused. "Some things are not spoken because they are fragile," he said, his voice low. "Some because they are strong." Eloin met his gaze, the weight of his words settling deep. She wanted to tell him what she felt, to name the fear and the hope tangled together inside her. Instead, she nodded, allowing silence to carry what speech could not. He stepped into the snow, his figure quickly swallowed by white, leaving behind a house that felt both fuller and emptier than before. As she closed the door, Eloin leaned against it, her breath unsteady. The storm had passed, but something else had begun, something she could not retreat from so easily. She pressed a hand to her chest, recognizing the truth she had not spoken aloud, the one the town would never grant her permission to feel, and understood that silence, once protective, had become a promise she was no longer certain she could keep. The morning after the storm broke clear and cruel, the kind of cold that sharpened every sound and left no room for softness. Frost Creek emerged from the white like a judgment rendered without appeal. Roof lines glittered with ice. Smoke rose straight and thin, as if the town itself were holding its breath. Eloin stepped outside and felt the chill cut through her coat, settling into her bones with a familiarity that felt almost intimate. Winter had loosened its grip, just enough to remind everyone who still held the power. Taza Red Elk did not return that day, nor the next. His absence moved through the town faster than his presence ever had. People noticed the empty space near the woodpile, the silence where quiet labor once spoke for him. Sheriff Amos Calder rode past the boarding house twice before noon, his eyes lingering on the door as if expecting confession to appear on the step. By afternoon, word reached Eloin without ceremony. Taza had been dismissed. Not formally, not with accusation or trial, but with the polite firmness reserved for inconveniences that had outlived their usefulness. Eloin heard the news while kneading dough, her hands dusted white, her pulse steady until it wasn't. She finished what she was doing before sitting down, gripping the edge of the table as the truth settled. Frost Creek had chosen comfort over conscience, order over gratitude. The town had decided what kind of peace it preferred, and Taza did not belong in it. That evening, Sheriff Calder came himself, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. He spoke of tensions, of winter weariness, of the need to restore calm. He assured her it was temporary, that the Apache would find work elsewhere once the passes cleared. His voice was practiced, his concern measured. Eloin listened, her face composed, and understood that this was the cost the town demanded for her quiet defiance. "You should be careful," he added, almost gently. "People talk." "I know," she replied, and meant more than he understood. After he left, Eloin moved through the house as if in a dream. She folded sheets that did not need folding, stirred a pot already warm. Every small task felt weighted now, no longer neutral, but charged with consequence. Loving silently had seemed safe. Being seen, even without words, had proven otherwise. Days passed. The weather softened, but the town hardened in response. Miriam Fitch resumed her greetings, overly bright, as though nothing unpleasant had occurred. Old Thomas Kincaid avoided her eyes entirely. Frost Creek congratulated itself on restoring balance, on making a necessary correction. Eloin felt the shape of isolation close around her, familiar yet sharper than before. She had lived alone for years, but solitude chosen was different from solitude imposed. At night, she sat by the window, watching the road beyond town, knowing he would not appear. She told herself it was better this way, that the quiet ache was preferable to open conflict. Yet each argument rang hollow. Something essential had been asked of her, and she had not yet answered. When Taza returned, it was not with announcement or apology. He arrived at dusk 3 days later, leading a horse limping from a twisted hoof. He brought it to the farrier, said nothing to anyone else, and prepared to leave again before nightfall. Eloin saw him from her window, his profile etched against the fading light, and felt decision rise like a tide she could no longer hold back. She met him at the edge of town, where Frost Creek thinned into open land. Snow crunched beneath her boots, each step deliberate. He stopped when he saw her, surprise flickering across his face before settling into something gentler. They stood facing one another, the space between them heavy with what had already been decided by others. "They told me you were sent away," she said. "I was," he replied. No bitterness, no anger. Just fact. "This is my fault," she said, the words tasting like iron. He shook his head once. "It was their choice." "But it costs you," she insisted. "It costs you too," he said quietly. The truth of that landed harder than accusation ever could. Eloan felt the weight of the town pressing at her back, felt the narrow path laid out for her, safe and small. She had walked it for years, believing restraint was the same as wisdom. Now it felt like a cage she had helped build. "I cannot ask you to stay," she said, voice unsteady. "Not like this." "I did not come to be asked," he replied. "I came to see if you would still look at me the same." She did. In that moment she saw him clearly, not as the town named him, not as a problem to be managed, but as a man who had stood in her storm without demand. The realization stripped something away inside her, leaving behind a clarity that frightened her with its simplicity. "I want to protect you," she said. "From them?" he asked, glancing back toward town. "Or from yourself?" She had no answer. The question lingered, sharp and necessary. They parted without embrace, without promise. Taza turned back toward the road that would take him beyond Frost Creek, and Eloan watched until distance claimed him. The walk home felt longer than it ever had, each step echoing with what she had not said. That night, the boarding house felt impossibly large. Eloan moved through empty rooms, touching doorframes, smoothing blankets, as though memorizing the life she might soon be asked to leave behind. The fire burned low, casting long shadows that stretched and retreated like indecision. She sat alone at the table and finally allowed herself to speak the truth aloud, the words soft but irrevocable. "It is too late," she whispered, tears gathering without falling. "I am in love." Outside the wind shifted, carrying with it the distant sound of hooves on frozen ground, fading slowly, as if daring her to decide whether silence would remain her refuge, or her regret. The night Eloan finally chose did not arrive with ceremony. It came the way truth often does, slipping in quietly after everyone else had gone to sleep, when excuses were too tired to stand guard. Frost Creek lay hushed beneath a pale moon, the snow crusted hard enough to carry sound. Eloan sat at the small table long after the fire dimmed, her hands folded, her breath steady, feeling the echo of words she had spoken into the dark and could not take back. Loving had changed her posture toward the world. It had shifted something permanent. By dawn, the decision had weight. She rose before light, braided her white hair with deliberate care, and dressed not for warmth alone but for resolve. Outside, the sky hung low and metallic, promising another bitter day. She stepped into the cold and felt it bite, welcoming the pain as proof she was awake. Frost Creek stirred slowly, unaware that one of its quietest residents had reached the end of obedience. She did not go to the store or the church. She followed the road beyond town, the one that thinned into open land, her boots crunching over frozen snow. Each step carried her farther from the life she had been told was sufficient. The wind pressed against her back, urging haste, as though the land itself understood what was at stake. When she crested the ridge, she saw him. Taza Red Elk stood beside a small fire, his horse tethered nearby, steam rising from its flanks. He looked up as she approached, surprise giving way to something deeper, something careful. He did not move toward her. He waited, granting her the dignity of choice. Eloan stopped a few paces away, the distance between them charged with everything they had left unsaid. "I am not here to ask you to stay," she said, her voice steady despite the cold tightening her throat. "I am here because I cannot stay behind." He searched her face, as if memorizing it against the possibility of loss. "This road is not kind," he said. "It will cost you." "It already has," she replied. "Only now I know what I am paying for." Before he could answer, the sound of hooves carried up the ridge. Sheriff Amos Calder emerged from the bend in the road, flanked by two men, their expressions rigid with purpose. Frost Creek had noticed her absence. It had decided to intervene. The sheriff reined in, eyes flicking between them, jaw tightening as though bracing for resistance. "This needs to end," he said, addressing Eloan but watching Taza. "You belong in town." "He does not." Eloan felt fear stir, sharp and familiar, but it no longer commanded her. "I belong where I choose," she said. "That is what you taught us to believe." Calder's mouth thinned. "You are making trouble for yourself." "Trouble has already been made," Taza said quietly. "You simply named it late." The men shifted, uneasy. Winter light glinted off rifle barrels. For a moment, everything balanced on the edge of violence. Frost Creek preferred not to acknowledge. Eloan stepped forward then, placing herself between them, her presence an act of defiance that drew a sharp breath from the sheriff. "If you want him gone," she said, "you will have to carry me with him." Silence followed, heavy and absolute. Calder looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a harmless widow, but as a woman who had chosen. The cost of forcing the issue weighed against the comfort of retreat. At last, he tipped his hat, a gesture more weary than gracious. "This town remembers," he said. "And it does not forget easily." "Neither do I," Eloan replied. They turned back toward Frost Creek, their retreat unceremonious, the problem left unresolved because resolution demanded courage they did not possess. When they were gone, Eloan's knees trembled, the delayed echo of fear catching up to her. Taza reached out then, steadying her with a hand firm and warm. This time, she did not pull away. They traveled together as winter loosened its grip, moving with the cautious optimism of those who knew survival depended on patience. Days stretched into weeks, the landscape changing slowly, snow giving way to earth dark with promise. Eloan learned the rhythm of the road, the language of wind and track. Taza learned the quiet strength of her endurance, the way she met hardship without complaint. They spoke often now, of small things and large ones, building a life not from declarations but from shared effort. When they returned to Frost Creek in early spring, the town looked smaller, its judgments dulled by time and necessity. People stared, some with curiosity, some with disapproval, but fewer with certainty. Eloan felt no need to explain. She walked beside Taza through the center of town, her head high, her hand brushing his sleeve, unashamed of the choice she had made. They settled at the edge of town, close enough to be known, far enough to remain free. Eloan reopened the boarding house on her own terms, its doors welcoming those stranded by weather or circumstance. Taza came and went with the seasons, but he always returned, his presence as constant as the fire she kept burning. Years later, when winter came again, Eloan stood at the window, her reflection lined but bright, and watched Taza cross the yard toward her, snow dusting his shoulders. The town no longer whispered. It had learned slowly that some truths did not bend to belief. As he reached the door, she felt the quiet thrill of recognition, the certainty earned through choosing and being chosen in return. Love, she understood now, was not something granted by time or permission. It was something claimed at cost, by those willing to stand in the cold and say, without apology, that anything worth having was worth everything. If our stories move you, their slow-burn emotions, quiet strength and heartfelt moments, please subscribe to our channel. Here, every story isn't just told, it's felt. Your support helps us bring you more unforgettable, soul-touching tales.